Welcome to my videos. AWS DevOps Engineer, Professional Latest Exam Questions and Answers Set 2. A DevOps engineer wants to find a solution to migrate an application from on-premises to AWS. The application is running on Linux and needs to run on specific versions of Apache Tomcat, HA proxy, and Varnish cache to function properly. The application's operating system level parameters require tuning. The solution must include a way to automate the deployment of new application versions. The infrastructure should be scalable and faulty servers should be replaced automatically. Which solution should the DevOps engineer use? A. Upload the application as a Docker image that contains all the necessary software to Amazon ECR. Create an Amazon ECS cluster using an AWS Fargate launch type and an auto-scaling group. Create an AWS code pipeline that uses Amazon ECR as a source and Amazon ECS as a deployment provider. B. Upload the application code to an AWS code commit repository with a saved configuration file to configure and install the software. Create an AWS Elastic Beanstalk web server tier and a load balance type environment that uses the Tomcat solution stack. Create an AWS code pipeline that uses code commit as a source and Elastic Beanstalk as a deployment provider. C. Upload the application code to an AWS code commit repository with a set of EB extensions files to configure and install the software. Create an AWS Elastic Beanstalk worker tier environment that uses the Tomcat solution stack. Create an AWS code pipeline that uses code commit as a source and Elastic Beanstalk as a deployment provider. D. Upload the application code to an AWS code commit repository with an appspec.yml file to configure and install the necessary software. Create an AWS code deployment group associated with an Amazon EC2 auto-scaling group. Create an AWS code pipeline that uses code commit as a source and code deploy as a deployment provider. Correct answer, A. A company wants to use AWS CloudFormation for infrastructure deployment. The company has strict tagging and resource requirements and wants to limit the deployment to 2 regions. Developers will need to deploy multiple versions of the same application. Which solution ensures resources are deployed in accordance with company policy? A. Create AWS Trusted Advisor checks to find and remediate unapproved CloudFormation stack sets. B. Create a CloudFormation drift detection operation to find and remediate unapproved CloudFormation stack sets. C. Create CloudFormation stack sets with approved CloudFormation templates. D. Create AWS Service Catalog products with approved CloudFormation templates. Correct answer, C. A DevOps engineer must track the health of a stateless RESTful service sitting behind a classic load balancer. The deployment of new application revisions is through a C/CD pipeline. If the service's latency increases beyond a defined threshold, deployment should be stopped until the service has recovered. Which of the following methods allow for the quickest detection time? A. Use Amazon CloudWatch metrics provided by Elastic Load Balancing to calculate average latency. Alarm and stop deployment when latency increases beyond the defined threshold. B. Use AWS Lambda and Elastic Load Balancing access logs to detect average latency. Alarm and stop deployment when latency increases beyond the defined threshold. C. Use AWS Code Deploy's minimum healthy host setting to define thresholds for rolling back deployments. If these thresholds are breached, roll back the deployment. D. Use metric filters to parse application logs in Amazon CloudWatch logs. Create a filter for latency. Alarm and stop deployment when latency increases beyond the defined threshold. Correct answer, C. An AWS code pipeline has implemented a code release process. The pipeline is integrated with AWS Code Deploy to deploy versions of an application to multiple Amazon EC2 instances for each code pipeline stage. During a recent deployment, the pipeline failed due to a code deploy issue. The DevOps team wants to improve monitoring and notifications during deployment to decrease resolution times. What should the DevOps engineer do to create notifications when issues are discovered? A. Implement AWS CloudWatch logs for code pipeline and code deploy. Create an AWS config rule to evaluate code deployment issues, and create an Amazon SNS topic to notify stakeholders of deployment issues. B. Implement AWS CloudWatch events for code pipeline and code deploy. Create an AWS Lambda function to evaluate code deployment issues, and create an Amazon SNS topic to notify stakeholders of deployment issues. C. Implement AWS CloudTrail to record code pipeline and code deploy API call information. Create an AWS Lambda function to evaluate code deployment issues, and create an Amazon SNS topic to notify stakeholders of deployment issues. D. Implement AWS CloudWatch events for code pipeline and code deploy. Create an Amazon Inspector Assessment target to evaluate code deployment issues, and create an Amazon SNS topic to notify stakeholders of deployment issues. Correct answer, B. A development team is using AWS Code Commit to version control application code and AWS Code Pipeline to orchestrate software deployments. The team has decided to use a remote master branch as the trigger for the pipeline to integrate code changes. A developer has pushed code changes to the code commit repository, but noticed that the pipeline had no reaction, even after 10 minutes. Which of the following actions should be taken to troubleshoot this issue? A. Check that an Amazon CloudWatch events rule has been created for the master branch to trigger the pipeline. B. Check that the code pipeline service rule has permission to access the code commit repository. C. Check that the developer's IAM role has permission to push to the code commit repository. D. Check to see if the pipeline failed to start because of code commit errors in Amazon CloudWatch logs. Correct answer, A. A DevOps engineer is deploying a new version of a company's application in an AWS Code Deploy deployment group associated with its Amazon EC2 instances. After some time, the deployment fails. The engineer realizes that all the events associated with the specific deployment ID are in a skipped status, and code was not deployed in the instances associated with the deployment group. What are valid reasons for this failure? Choose 2. A. The networking configuration does not allow the EC2 instances to reach the Internet via a NAT gateway or Internet gateway, and the code deploy endpoint cannot be reached. B. The IAM user who triggered the application deployment does not have permission to interact with the code deploy endpoint. C. The target EC2 instances were not properly registered with the code deploy endpoint. D. An instance profile with proper permissions was not attached to the target EC2 instances. E. The appspec.yml file was not included in the application revision. Correct answer, B and C. A company has an application that is using a MySQL-compatible Amazon or multi-OS DB cluster as the database. A cross-region read replica has been created for disaster recovery purposes. A DevOps engineer wants to automate the promotion of the replica so it becomes the primary database instance in the event of a failure. Which solution will accomplish this? A. Configure a latency-based Amazon Route 53 CNAME with health checks so it points to both the primary and replica endpoints. Subscribe an Amazon SNS topic to Amazon RDS failure notifications from AWS CloudTrail and use that topic to trigger an AWS Lambda function that will promote the replica instance as the master. B. Create an or a custom endpoint to point to the primary database instance. Configure the application to use this endpoint. Configure AWS CloudTrail to run an AWS Lambda function to promote the replica instance and modify the custom endpoint to point to the newly promoted instance. C. Create an AWS Lambda function to modify the application's AWS CloudFormation template to promote the replica, apply the template to update the stack, and point the application to the newly promoted instance. Create an Amazon CloudWatch alarm to trigger this Lambda function after the failure event occurs. D. Store the Aurora endpoint in AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store. Create an Amazon Event Bridge, Amazon CloudWatch Events, event that defects the database failure and runs an AWS Lambda function to promote the replica instance and update the endpoint URL stored in AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store. Code the application to reload the endpoint from parameter store if a database connection fails. Correct answer, B. An application has microservices spread across different AWS accounts and is integrated with an on-premises legacy system for some of its functionality. Because of the segmented architecture and missing logs, every time the application experiences issues, it is taking too long to gather the logs to identify the issues. A DevOps engineer must fix the log aggregation process and provide a way to centrally analyze the logs. Which is the most efficient and cost-effective solution? A. Collect system logs and application logs by using the Amazon CloudWatch Logs agent. Use the Amazon S3 API to export on-premises logs, and store the logs in an S3 bucket in a central account. Build an Amazon EMR cluster to reduce the logs and derive the root cause. B. Collect system logs and application logs by using the Amazon CloudWatch Logs agent. Use the Amazon S3 API to import on-premises logs. Store all logs in S3 buckets in individual accounts. Use Amazon Macy to write a query to search for the required specific event-related data point. C. Collect system logs and application logs using the Amazon CloudWatch Logs agent. Install the CloudWatch Logs agent on the on-premises servers. Transfer all logs from AWS to the on-premises data center. Use an Amazon Elasticsearch Logs Kibana stack to analyze logs on premises. D. Collect system logs and application logs by using the Amazon CloudWatch Logs agent. Install a CloudWatch Logs agent for on-premises resources. Store all logs in an S3 bucket in a central account. Set up an Amazon S3 trigger and an AWS Lambda function to analyze incoming logs and automatically identify anomalies. Use Amazon Athena to run ad hoc queries on the logs in the central account. Correct answer, D. A company's DevOps engineer is working in a multi-account environment. The company uses AWS Transit Gateway to route all outbound traffic through a network operations account. In the network operations account, all account traffic passes through a firewall appliance for inspection before the traffic goes to an internet gateway. The firewall appliance sends logs to Amazon CloudWatch Logs and includes event severities of critical, high, medium, low, and info. The security team wants to receive an alert if any critical events occur. What should the DevOps engineer do to meet these requirements? A. Create an Amazon CloudWatch Synthetics canary to monitor the firewall state. If the firewall reaches a critical state or logs a critical event, use a CloudWatch alarm to publish a notification to an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic. Subscribe the security team's email address to the topic. B. Create an Amazon CloudWatch Medic filter by using a search for critical events. Publish a custom metric for the finding. Use a CloudWatch alarm based on the custom metric to publish a notification to an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic. Subscribe the security team's email address to the topic. C. Enable Amazon Guard Duty in the network operations account. Configure Guard Duty to monitor flow logs. Create an Amazon Event Bridge, Amazon CloudWatch Events, event rule that is invoked by Guard Duty events that are critical. Define an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic as a target. Subscribe the security team's email address to the topic. D. Use AWS Firewall Manager to apply consistent policies across all accounts. Create an Amazon Event Bridge, Amazon CloudWatch Events, event rule that is invoked by Firewall Manager events that are critical. Define an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic as a target. Subscribe the security team's email address to the topic. Correct answer, C. A company recently migrated its legacy application from on-premises to AWS. The application is hosted on Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, which is behind Amazon API Gateway. The company wants to ensure users experience minimal disruptions during any deployment of a new version of the application. The company also wants to ensure it can quickly roll back updates if there is an issue. Which solution will meet these requirements with minimal changes to the application? A. Introduce changes as a separate environment parallel to the existing one. Configure API Gateway to use a canary release deployment to send a small subset of user traffic to the new environment. B. Introduce changes as a separate environment parallel to the existing one. Update the application's DNS alias records to point to the new environment. C. Introduce changes as a separate target group behind the existing application load balancer. Configure API gateway to route user traffic to the new target group in steps. D. Introduce changes as a separate target group behind the existing application load balancer. Configure API gateway to route all traffic to the application load balancer, which then sends the traffic to the new target group. Correct answer, C. A company recently launched an application that is more popular than expected. The company wants to ensure the application can scale to meet increasing demands and provide reliability using multiple availability zones, AZs. The application runs on a fleet of Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, ALB. A DevOps engineer has created an auto-scaling group across multiple AZs for the application. Instances launched in the newly added AZs are not receiving any traffic for the application. What is likely causing this issue? A. Auto-scaling groups can create new instances in a single AZ only. B. The EC2 instances have not been manually associated to the ALB. C. The ALB should be replaced with a network load balancer, NLB. D. The new AZ has not been added to the ALB. Correct answer, D. A DevOps engineer manages a web application that runs on Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, ALB. The instances run in an EC2 auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones. The engineer needs to implement a deployment strategy that launches a second fleet of instances with the same capacity as the original fleet, maintains the original fleet unchanged while the second fleet is launched, transitions traffic to the second fleet when the second fleet is fully deployed, terminates the original fleet automatically 1 hour after transition. Which solution will satisfy these requirements? A. Use an AWS CloudFormation template with a retention policy for the ALB set to 1 hour. Update the Amazon Route 53 record to reflect the new ALB. B. Use 2 AWS Elastic Beanstalk environments to perform a blue/green deployment from the original environment to the new one. Create an application version lifecycle policy to terminate the original environment in 1 hour. C. Use AWS Code Deploy with a deployment group configured with a blue/green deployment configuration. Select the option Terminate the original instances in the deployment group with a waiting period of 1 hour. D. Use AWS Elastic Beanstalk with a configuration set to immutable. Create an EB extension using the resources key that sets the deletion policy of the ALB to 1 hour, and deploy the application. Correct answer, C. A healthcare services company is concerned about the growing costs of software licensing for an application for monitoring patient wellness. The company wants to create an audit process to ensure that the application is running exclusively on Amazon EC2 dedicated hosts. A DevOps engineer must create a workflow to audit the application to ensure compliance. What steps should the engineer take to meet this requirement with the least administrative overhead? A. Use AWS Systems Manager Configuration Compliance. Use calls to the Put Compliance Items API action to scan and build a database of non-compliant EC2 instances based on their host placement configuration. Use an Amazon DynamoDB table to store these instance IDs for fast access. Generate a report through Systems Manager by calling the List Compliance Summaries API action. B. Use custom Java code running on an EC2 instance. Set up EC2 auto-scaling for the instance depending on the number of instances to be checked. Send the list of non-compliant EC2 instance IDs to an Amazon SQS. Set up another worker instance to process instance IDs from the SQS and write them to Amazon DynamoDB. Use an AWS Lambda function to terminate non-compliant instance IDs obtained from the queue, and send them to an Amazon SNS email topic for distribution. C. Use AWS config. Identify all EC2 instances to be audited by enabling config recording on all Amazon EC2 resources for the region. Create a custom AWS config rule that triggers an AWS Lambda function by using the Euro config rule change triggered Euro blueprint. Modify the Lambda evaluate compliance function to verify host placement to return a non-compliant result if the instance is not running on an EC2 dedicated host. Use the AWS config report to address non-compliant instances. Use AWS CloudTrail. Identify all EC2 instances to be audited by analyzing all calls to the EC2 run command API action. Invoke an AWS Lambda function that analyzes the host placement of the instance. Store the EC2 instance ID of non-compliant resources in an Amazon RDS MySQL DB instance. Generate a report by querying the RDS instance and exporting the query results to a CSV text file. Correct answer, C. A company has 100 gigabytes of log data in an Amazon S3 bucket stored in CSV format. SQL developers want to query this data and generate graphs to visualize it. They also need an efficient, automated way to store metadata from the CSV file. Which combination of steps should be taken to meet these requirements with the least amount of effort? Choose 3. A. Filter the data through AWS X-Ray to visualize the data. B. Filter the data through Amazon QuickSight to visualize the data. C. Query the data with Amazon Athena. D. Query the data with Amazon Redshift. E. Use AWS Glue as the persistent metadata store. F. Use Amazon S3 as the persistent metadata store. Correct answer, B, C, F. A DevOps engineer has several legacy applications that all generate different log formats. The engineer must standardize the formats before writing them to Amazon S3 for querying and analysis. How can this requirement be met at the lowest cost? A. Have the application send its logs to an Amazon EMR cluster and normalize the logs before sending them to Amazon S3. B. Have the application send its logs to Amazon QuickSight, then use the Amazon QuickSight Spice engine to normalize the logs. Do the analysis directly from Amazon QuickSight. C. Keep the logs in Amazon S3 and use Amazon Redshift Spectrum to normalize the logs in place. D. Use Amazon Kinesis Agent on each server to upload the logs and have Amazon Kinesis Data Firehose use an AWS Lambda function to normalize the logs before writing them to Amazon S3. Correct answer, D. A company needs to implement a robust C/CD pipeline to automate the deployment of an application in AWS. The pipeline must support continuous integration, continuous delivery, and automatic rollback upon deployment failure. The entire C/CD pipeline must be capable of being reprovisioned in alternate AWS accounts or regions within minutes. A DevOps engineer has already created an AWS code commit repository to store the source code. Which combination of actions should be taken when building this pipeline to meet these requirements? Choose 3. A. Configure an AWS code pipeline with a build stage using AWS code build. B. Copy the build artifact from code commit to Amazon S3. C. Create an auto-scaling group of Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, ALB, and set the ALB as the deployment target in AWS code pipeline. D. Create an AWS Elastic Beanstalk environment as the deployment target in AWS code pipeline. E. Implement an Amazon SQSQ to decouple the pipeline components. F. Provision all resources using AWS CloudFormation. Correct answer, A, B, D. A company is building a solution for storing files containing personally identifiable information, PII, on AWS. Requirements state, all data must be encrypted at rest and in transit. All data must be replicated in at least 2 locations that are at least 500 miles, 805 kilometers, apart. Which solution meets these requirements? A. Create primary and secondary Amazon S3 buckets in 2 separate availability zones that are at least 500 miles, 805 kilometers, apart. Use a bucket policy to enforce access to the buckets only through HTTPS. Use a bucket policy to enforce Amazon S3 SSEC on all objects uploaded to the bucket. Configure cross-region replication between the 2 buckets. B. Create primary and secondary Amazon S3 buckets in 2 separate AWS regions that are at least 500 miles, 805 kilometers, apart. Use a bucket policy to enforce access to the buckets only through HTTPS. Use a bucket policy to enforce S3 managed keys, SSCS3, on all objects uploaded to the bucket. Configure cross-region replication between the two buckets. C. Create primary and secondary Amazon S3 buckets in two separate AWS regions that are at least 500 miles, 805 kilometers, apart. Use an IAM role to enforce access to the buckets only through HTTPS. Use a bucket policy to enforce Amazon S3 managed keys, SSCS3, on all objects uploaded to the bucket. Configure cross-region replication between the two buckets. D. Create primary and secondary Amazon S3 buckets in two separate availability zones that are at least 500 miles, 805 kilometers, apart. Use a bucket policy to enforce access to the buckets only through HTTPS. Use a bucket policy to enforce AWS KMS encryption on all objects uploaded to the bucket. Configure cross-region replication between the two buckets. Create a KMS customer master key, CMK, in the primary region for encrypting objects. Correct answer, B. A company is using an AWS code build project to build and package an application. The packages are copied to a shared Amazon S3 bucket before being deployed across multiple AWS accounts. The buildspec.yml file contains the following. The DevOps engineer has noticed that anybody with an AWS account is able to download the artifacts. What steps should the DevOps engineer take to stop this? The DevOps engineer has noticed that anybody with an AWS account is able to download the artifacts. What steps should the DevOps engineer take to stop this? A. Modify the post_build to command to use a public read and configure a bucket policy that grants read access to the relevant AWS accounts only. B. Configure a default ACL for the S3 bucket that defines the set of authenticated users as the relevant AWS accounts only and grants read-only access. C. Create an S3 bucket policy that grants read access to the relevant AWS accounts and denies read access to the principal. D. Modify the post_build command to remove authenticated read and configure a bucket policy that allows read access to the relevant AWS accounts only. Correct answer, A. A DevOps engineer needs to grant several external contractors access to a legacy application that runs on an Amazon Linux Amazon EC2 instance. The application server is available only in a private subnet. The contractors are not authorized for VPN access. What should the DevOps engineer do to grant the contractors access to the application server? A. Create an IAM user and SSH keys for each contractor. Add the public SSH key to the application server's SSH authorized _keys file. Instruct the contractors to install the AWS CLI and AWS Systems Manager Session Manager plugin, update their AWS credentials files with their private keys, and use the AWS SSM Start Session command to gain access to the target application server instance ID. B. Ask each contractor to securely send their SSH public key. Add this public key to the application server's SSH authorized keys file. Instruct the contractors to use their private key to connect to the application server through SSH. C. Ask each contractor to securely send their SSH public key. Use EC2 pairs to import their key. Update the application server's SSH authorized _keys file. Instruct the contractors to use their private key to connect to the application server through SSH. D. Create an IAM user for each contractor with programmatic access. Add each user to an IAM group that has a policy that allows the SSM Start Session action. Instruct the contractors to install the AWS CLI and AWS Systems Manager Session Manager plugin, update their AWS credentials files with their access keys, and use the AWS SSM Start Session to gain access to the target application server instance ID. Correct answer, B. A company hosts its staging website using an Amazon EC2 instance backed with Amazon EBS storage. The company wants to recover quickly with minimal data losses in the event of network connectivity issues or power failures on the EC2 instance. Which solution will meet these requirements? A. Add the instance to an EC2 auto-scaling group with the minimum, maximum, and desired capacity set to 1. B. Add the instance to an EC2 auto-scaling group with a lifecycle hook to detach the EBS volume when the EC2 instance shuts down or terminates. C. Create an Amazon CloudWatch alarm for the status check failed_system metric and select the EC2 action to recover the instance. D. Create an Amazon CloudWatch alarm for the status check failed_instance metric and select the EC2 action to reboot the instance. Correct answer, C.